Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis. Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Apologetics from the Attic. And today I want to do a little church history. Now, the reason I want to do this is because if you're anything like me, when you listen to debates or listen to people, to different scholars, and you try to educate yourself in certain matters by a lot of the ways people learn nowadays, watching YouTube videos or listening to podcasts, you'll hear a lot of sources referenced, but do we really have time to read and get a look at them? And especially, you'll hear assertions made about church history all the time. And how do you know if they're true? Well, you obviously have to study, read the primary, secondary sources for yourself. So for those of you who listen, and maybe when you listen, you do like I do. A lot of times I listen to podcasts while I'm driving, while I'm doing the dishes, while I'm doing laundry, while I'm doing stuff around the house, running errands, going grocery shopping. I always have a earbud in my ear listening to the latest podcast, the latest whatever. So it just gives you the ability to take in some of this information while you're doing that instead of, finding the time to sit down for an hour or two and actually read a book. So what we're going to be reading from today is History of the Christian Church by Phillip Schaff. This is volume 3. And this is, I don't know if you know you can buy this edition anymore. It's, It's like 7 volumes, maybe 8. My friend Justin gifted this to me many years ago, and it's been a helpful tool. I'm trying to work my way through it. I'm on volume 2, several hundred pages in, but just trying to work slowly through it. So what topic we're going to cover today is the Pelagian Controversy. And the reason why this is important is because if you engage at all in the debate with the provisionists, especially, and those, Dr. Leighton Flowers and guys from Trinity Radio and Provisionist Perspective. When you ask about Augustine, and actually the last episode we covered, Dr. Flowers was asked, how does your view differ from Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism? If you remember, his answer was basically to dismiss it and say, well, Pelagius wasn't really a Pelagian. That's all made up. Political intrigue. We have scholars now who say Pelagius actually wasn't a Pelagian. His doctrine was made up by Augustine, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let's see if that's the case. So let me pull the book cam up so you can read along with me if you're watching on YouTube. Let's make sure we got enough room here. Let's back this up a tad. Yeah, I just got this little webcam and I put it on a mic stand, taped it to it, and then you can zoomed in a little too much. There we go. All right, nice and large. Let it focus. All right. So he's got a whole section on the anthropological controversies in this volume, but we're just going to look. So this is more of the factual step by step of the Pelagian controversy. So let's just start reading. I'll comment here and there, but just like I said, this episode is just to get this information into your hearing if you're on the go, and it can help educate you about this, there's a lot of sweeping, misleading claims flattening out the history of this Pelagian controversy. And I'll stop and make comments and note where I think we can see where there's some misleading claims being made, especially by the provisionists about this issue. So this is the external history of the Pelagian controversy, AD 411 to 431. So that's the 20 years that this controversy was happening. Pelagius was a simple monk, born about the middle of the 4th century in Britain, the extremity of the civilized world. He was a man of clear intellect, mild disposition, learned culture, and spotless character. Even Augustine, with all his abhorrence of his doctrines, repeatedly speaks respectfully of the man. He studied the Greek theology, especially that of the Antiochian school, and early showed great zeal for the improvement of himself and of the world. But his morality was not so much the rich, deep life of faith as it was the external legalism, the ascetic self-discipline, and self-righteousness of monkery. It was characteristic that even before the controversy, he took great offense at the well-known saying of Augustine, quote, "Give what thou commandest, and command what thou wilt." And that's pretty well known that that was one of the statements of Augustine that Pelagius did not like. He could not conceive the power to obey the commandment must come from the same source as the commandment itself. Faith with him was hardly more than a theoretical belief. The main thing in religion was moral action, the keeping of the commandments of God by one's own strength. This is also shown in the introductory remarks of his letter to Demetrius, a noble Roman nun of the gens Anicia, in which he describes a model virgin as a proof of the excellency of human nature. Quote, this is a quote from Pelagius, "As often as I have to speak concerning moral improvement and the leading of a holy life, I am accustomed first to set forth the power and quality of human nature and to show what it can accomplish. For never are we able to enter upon the path of the virtues unless hope as companion draws us to them. For every longing after anything dies within us as soon as we despair of attaining that thing," unquote. Very interesting, right? And that's if you want to go to original source material, that document's out there. Pelagius's letter to Demetrius. I actually have an episode I did years back where we cover some of that if you want to go back and listen to that episode. In the year 409, Pelagius, already advanced in life, was in Rome and composed a brief commentary on the epistles of Paul. This commentary, which has been preserved among the works of Jerome, displays a clear and sober exegetical talent. He labored quietly and peacefully for the improvement of the corrupt morals of Rome and converted the advocate Celestius. Now, that name's going to become important, Celestius. So Celestius became one of Pelagius' disciples. Of distinguished but otherwise unknown birth, that's Celestius, to his monastic life and his views. It was from this man, younger, more skillful in argument, more ready for controversy, and more rigorously consistent than his teacher, that the controversy took its rise. So that's important. So if someone is claiming to have assertions about the Pelagian controversy, if they don't understand that Celestius actually was the one who took Pelagius's doctrine and formalized it, argued for it, and really was the one who was the occasion for the controversy to arise in the first place, not Pelagius himself, you can tell right there that's a red flag. They don't know their history about this. Pelagius was the moral author, Celestius the intellectual author of the system represented by them. They did not mean actually to found a new system, but believed themselves in accordance with Scripture and established doctrine. They were more concerned with the ethical side of Christianity than with the dogmatic, but their endeavor after moral perfection was based upon certain views of the natural power of the will, and these views proved to be in conflict with anthropological principles which had been developed in the African church for the previous 10 years under the influence of Augustine. So that's important. So they didn't seek to found a new systematic or dogmatic. They just had a certain outcome that they were a moralistic view of what they wanted to accomplish, and the doctrine that underlied that view came in conflict with the African church, North African church. In the year 411, the two friends thus united in sentiment left Rome to escape the dreaded Gothic king Alaric and went to Africa. That's interesting. So in God's providence, they were forced out of Rome by, what was that, the sacking of Rome? Around that time? Was that when? Anyway, I'm not too well versed on the exact history of that. They passed through Hippo, intending to visit Augustine, but found that he was just then at Carthage, occupied with the Donatists. And that's something you need to know too. We could do a study and reading on what the Donatist controversy was. Pelagius wrote him a very courteous letter, which Augustine answered in a similar tone, intimating, however, the importance of holding the true doctrine concerning sin. So that's interesting. So Pelagius and Celestius sought out to meet Augustine, but he just happened not to be there when they arrived. He was dealing with other matters. So Pelagius wrote him a letter, and courteous one, and Augustine wrote him back. Now he said it was a good, courteous letter back from Augustine, but he did say this. He said, quote, and this is in the letter Augustine wrote to Pelagius, "Pray for me," he said, "that God may really make me that which you already take me to be." Pelagius soon proceeded to Palestine. Celestius applied for presbyter's orders in Carthage, the very place where he had most reason to expect opposition. This inconsiderate step brought on the crisis. He gained many friends, it is true, by his talents and his ascetic zeal, but at the same time awakened suspicion by his novel opinions. Quite interesting there, huh? So then they travel to Carthage, and it seems like what Schaff is saying here is Celestius purposely chose a place to try to seek holy orders, presbyter's orders, become a priest or presbyter, get ordination. And it was almost expected that he would be opposed. And he did that on purpose as to stir up controversy. The deacon Paulinus of Milan, who was just then in Carthage, and who shortly afterward, at the request of Augustine, wrote the Life of Ambrose, warned the bishop Aurelius against Celestius at a council held by Aurelius at Carthage in 412, and appeared as his accuser. 6 or 7 errors he asserted he had found in the writings of Celestius. So this is very important. So once again, if the claim is that, well, Pelagius really wasn't a Pelagian, Augustine made things up, notice, Augustine isn't even in the controversy yet. He's away dealing with the Donatist controversy. The first person to step up against the Pelagian controversy is a guy named Paulinus of Milan. Paulinus of Milan, a deacon. So realize that. And there's a council held in Carthage of 412, and the bishop presiding is Bishop Aurelius. And he brings forth errors that he found in Celestius' writings. So what are these errors? Well, here we have them. So let's read these errors that Paulinus of Milan said against Celestius, Pelagius' disciple. So it's already separated. It jumps off without Pelagius or Augustine directly involved. It's Paulinus of Milan and Celestius. So see how if you flatten out the history, you're not even seeing some of these details, which become very important in how you understand how the Pelagian controversy came to be. So let's read these 7 points that Paulinus of Milan said were errors in Celestius' writings. 1, Adam was created mortal, and he would have died even if he had not sinned. 2, Adam's fall injured himself alone, not the human race. 3, children come into the world in the same condition in which Adam was before the fall. 4, the human race neither dies in consequence of Adam's fall, nor rises again in consequence of Christ's resurrection. 5, unbaptized children as well as others are saved. 6, the law as well as the gospel leads to the kingdom of heaven. 7, even before Christ there were sinless men. Quite interesting there, right? Those 7 points. And they are very connected to what we would consider today someone who has Pelagian or semi-Pelagian tendencies. Now, this is certainly not semi-Pelagian. This is full-blown Pelagian. A semi-Pelagian would not accept these 7 statements. So those were the 7 statements that Paulinus of Milan brought forth at the Council of Carthage here in 412. He continues, the principal propositions were the second and third, which are intimately connected and which afterwards become the especial subject of controversy. So Schaff is saying this number 2 and 3. So Adam's fall injured himself alone and not the human race. Children come into the world in the same condition in which Adam was before the fall. So those are the 2, and those are very important. So Pelagianism and even semi-Pelagianism, and certainly provisionism, really lean into, well, human beings are not born corrupted, and which leads to an inability which can only be cured by grace first coming to them. And of course, children come into the world in the same condition which Adam was before the fall. So the Pelagians denied that the fall of Adam spread any kind of corruption or any kind of taint into his children. We are all born in the condition Adam was before the fall. Celestius returned evasive answers. He declared the propositions to be speculative questions of the schools, which did not concern the substance of the faith, and respecting which different opinions existed in the church. He refused to recant of the errors charged upon him, and the synod excluded him from the communion of the church. He immediately went to Ephesus and was there ordained presbyter. Okay. So, first of all, how did he dodge it? I mean, this is very familiar when you have someone and you're trying to nail them down in their beliefs. Well, these are speculative opinions. These don't concern the substance of the faith. People can have different opinions on these issues. Why are we making such a big deal out of this? It's not so what you do is you shift the goalposts and say, well, you may not agree with what I'm saying here, but it's not the essence of the faith. So we really don't need to focus on that. And then, that's what he said. That was basically, he was evasive. He really didn't even answer the objections and give his doctrine. And then he didn't recant, and he was excommunicated. But then he went to Ephesus and was ordained presbyter there. So that was the state of the early church at this time, where you had bishops running different dioceses, different areas, and you'll see the bishops end up communicating about this issue, and it ends up getting into the entire communion, especially in the Western Church, and it gets into all the bishops, and the Bishop of Rome has to step in. But he was able to he could not get ordained in Carthage, but he ended up getting ordained in Ephesus. This is Celestius, by the way. This is not even Pelagius. Remember that. Augustine had taken no part personally in these transactions. See? Augustine isn't even around yet. So people are just flattening out the history of this if they say, well, this was just an argument between Augustine and Pelagius. No, it wasn't. Augustine wasn't even involved when it started yet. So don't hang on Augustine that he's the one. It was the synod at Carthage. It was a council at Carthage, 412, and it was presided over by the Bishop Aurelius. Bishop Aurelius is the one who ratified the decision to excommunicate him. So blame him. Stop blaming Augustine for everything. All right. Well, he was just a Manichaean Gnostic. Well, can you make that charge of Bishop Aurelius? Did he come out of Manichaeanism and he must have been a Gnostic too? See, when you understand the contours of church history, then some of these accusations that get leveled, which that's a common one. Well, Augustine was just a Gnostic. He never got over his Manichaeanism, and that's where his doctrine against Pelagius came from, was his Manichaeanism. Well, I don't think Aurelius had that background. I'd have to do a little more study on his background, but I don't think you can level that charge against him. So see how you can really have the context to respond to some of these accusations you hear in this misunderstanding of church history that goes around. Okay, we continue. So Augustine wasn't even there. But as the Pelagian doctrines found many adherents even in Africa and in Sicily, he wrote several treatises in refutation of them as so early as 412 and 415, expressing himself, however, with respect and forbearance. So even his first treatise, and he gives a little footnote there in Latin, De peccatorum meritus et remissine, de spiritu et littera, de natura et gratia, de perfectione justue hominis. I'm not good at Latin. Okay. So here we have the next section, the Pelagian Controversy in Palestine. Meanwhile, in 414, the controversy broke out in Palestine, where Pelagius was residing, and where he had aroused attention by the letter to the nun Demetrius. So his letter to Demetrius apparently didn't just stay a personal letter. It got circulated around, and it caused controversy because of that. His opinions gained much wider currency there, especially among the Origentists. For the Oriental Church had not been at all affected by the Augustinian views and accepted the two ideas of freedom and grace without attempting to define their precise relation to each other. But just then, there happened to be in Palestine two Western theologians, Jerome and Orosius, and they instituted opposition to Pelagius. Okay, so once again, yes, Augustine wrote some writings against the Pelagian view, but according to Schaff, they were, what did he say? They were with respect and forbearance. But then in Palestine, you have Jerome and Orosius. They are the ones who take up against Pelagius. So once again, Augustine isn't directly as involved as the deacon Paulinus of Milan and now Jerome and Orosius. Jerome, and I don't think this is the same Jerome that wrote the Latin Vulgate, that guy. I think it's a different Jerome. Jerome, who lived a monk at Bethlehem, was at first decidedly favorable to the synergistic theory of the Greek fathers, but at the same time agreed with Ambrose and Augustine in the doctrine of the absolutely universal corruption of sin. So that's important. You gotta look at Ambrose. So those who say Augustine was the inventor of some of these doctrines, especially the anthropological doctrines that people like to hang around his neck and say, well, his Manichaeanism started all this. You can't explain that by Ambrose. Ambrose also had the same view as Augustine if you look at his writings. But from an enthusiastic admirer of Origen, he had been changed to a bitter enemy. The doctrine of Pelagius concerning free will and the moral ability of human nature he attributed to the influence of Origen and Rufinus, and he took as a personal insult an attack of Pelagius on some of his writings. He therefore wrote against him, though from wounded pride and contempt he did not even mention his name, first in a letter answering inquiries of a certain Sisyphean at Rome, and then more at length in a dialogue of 3 books against the Pelagians, written toward the end of the year 415, and soon after the acquittal of Pelagius by the Synod of Jerusalem. Yet in this treatise and elsewhere, Jerome himself teaches the freedom of the will, and only a conditional predestination of divine foreknowledge, and thus with all his personal bitterness against the Pelagians, stands on a semi-Pelagian ground, though Augustine eulogizes the dialogue. So interesting. So Jerome wrote against Pelagius, but Schaff admits it was from wounded pride and his motives weren't the best. And then he ends up settling more in a semi-Pelagian position. Although Augustine eulogizes the dialogue. So Augustine, even though Jerome came down in a semi-Pelagian position, Augustine still honored the argumentation he was making and thought it was important. A young Spanish ecclesiastic, Paul Orosius, was at that time living with Jerome for the sake of more extended study, and had been sent to him by Augustine with letters relating to the Origenistic and Pelagian controversies. Okay, so this Paul was sent there by Augustine, and Augustine sent him with letters relating to these controversies. At a diocesan synod convoked by the Bishop John of Jerusalem in June 415, this Orosius appeared against Pelagius and gave information that a council at Carthage had condemned Celestius, that Augustine had written against his errors. Pelagius answered with okay, so now there's this council at Jerusalem in 415. It's a synod. And Orosius is sent by Augustine because obviously the communication back then, I mean, you didn't have any electricity, any modern anything. So a lot of times this stuff didn't get out. So apparently the Bishop John of Jerusalem did not know of the decision of Carthage, but this guy Orosius, he informed the bishop about this, and he must have had Augustine's writings against it as well handed to him. So Pelagius was summoned to the synod to answer these charges. So let's see. Pelagius answered with evasion and disparagement. Quote, "What matters Augustine to me?" Pelagius said. Orosius gave his opinion that a man who presumed to speak contumeliously, in a nasty manner, to the bishop, to whom the whole North African church owed her restoration, alluding apparently to the settlement of the Donatist controversies, deserved to be excluded from this is getting blurry. Deserved to be excluded from the communion of the whole church. So, he's basically, how can you talk about Augustine like that? And he's being evasive, and he's not even answering the charges against him. He's just saying, well, I don't care about Augustine. Forget him. John, who was a great admirer of the condemned Origen and made little account of the authority of Augustine, declared, "I am Augustine," and undertook the defense of the accused. He permitted Pelagius, although only a monk and a layman, to take his seat among the presbyters. Okay. So we have John of Jerusalem, who he was a great admirer of Origen, and it sounded like he tended to agree with Pelagius's views. And in a break of precedence, apparently only the ordained were allowed to take their seat among the presbyters, but he was seated among the ordained even as a monk and a layman. So that's interesting. Nor did he find fault with Pelagius's assertions. So this is Bishop John of Jerusalem who's presiding over the synod. That man can easily keep the commandments of God. So this is what John's saying. This is his view. Man can easily keep the commandments of God and become free from sin after the latter had conceded in a very indefinite manner that for this help of God is necessary. Wait, let me read that again. So this is John. He did not find fault with the Pelagius' assertion. Okay, so this is what Pelagius asserted, and he didn't find fault with it. That man can easily keep the commandments of God and become free from sin after the latter had conceded in a very indefinite manner that for this help of God, the help of God is necessary. So in other words, it sounds like the Pelagius was pushed to at least concede that God's help is needed to keep the commandments of God and become free from sin. So he couldn't go so far as to say, well, we don't even need God. No, we do need God's help. Pelagius had the advantage of understanding both languages, while John spoke only Greek, Orosius only Latin, and the interpreter often translated inaccurately. So those are those cool little details. So there was a language barrier issue even at the synod, which may have led to miscommunication and misunderstanding even in the argument that was going back and forth. After much discussion, it was resolved that the matter should be laid before the Roman bishop, Innocent, since both parties in the controversy belong to the Western Church. Meanwhile, these should refrain from all further attacks on each other. Okay, so the decision of John of Jerusalem in this synod was we are going to refer this matter to the Bishop of Rome, Innocent at the time. And they were said, don't attack each other anymore until we get this matter resolved by the Bishop of Rome. Interesting, right? A second Palestinian council resulted still more favorably to Pelagius. This consisted of 14 bishops and was held at Diospolis or Lydda in December of the same year under the presidency of Eulogius, Bishop of Caesarea, to judge the accusation preferred by two banished bishops of Gaul, Hieros and Lazarus, acting in concert with Jerome. Okay. So another accusation is brought. This time there's 14 bishops at this council, at this synod, and it's presided over by Eulogius, Bishop of Caesarea. So, and there were two banished bishops apparently that were bringing this accusation and in concert with Jerome, the same Jerome that brought the accusations before. The charges were unskillfully drawn up, and Pelagius was able to avail himself of equivocations and to condemn as folly, though not as heresy, the teachings of Celestius, which were also his own. The synod, of which John of Jerusalem was a member, did not go below the surface of the question, nor in fact understand it, but acquitted the accused of all heresy. Jerome is justified in calling this a miserable synod, although Augustine is also warranted in saying it was not heresy that was there acquitted, but the man who denied the heresy. So I don't know if this is, you'll hear, I've heard Idol Killer say it. I've heard Dr. Flowers say it. What is it? There's a number, 27. I forget what the number is, but it's a large number of accusations that Pelagius was all acquitted of. And that's why you can't say Pelagius was a Pelagian. I don't know if that was this council here, this synod that is being referred to. It may be. We don't give enough details as to what exactly was denied. But it would be interesting to dig deeper into that to see if that's what they're talking about. But according to Schaff, this synod really didn't accomplish anything because the charges were not skillfully drawn up. So those, as goes on with many debates, right? If you're going to have a theological debate, but you're not actually skillful enough to really crystallize what the heresy is so as to articulate it well, the person who's being accused of it can say, well, I don't believe any of that. So I don't know what you're talking about. This doesn't apply to me. So it sounds like that's what happened. And he was acquitted there. And I like Augustine's quote there. It was not the heresy that was there acquitted, but the man who denied the heresy. Jerome's polemical zeal against the Pelagians cost him dearly. In the beginning of the year 416, a mob of Pelagianizing monks, ecclesiastics, and vagabonds broke into his monastery at Bethlehem, maltreated the inmates, set the building on fire, and compelled the aged scholar to take flight. So there were roaming mobs of Pelagianizing monks, ecclesiastics, and vagabonds, and they all went into the monastery he was at, and they maltreated everyone. They burned it to the ground, and they cast him into exile. Wow, interesting. Bishop John of Jerusalem let this pass unpunished. Oh, so I guess they were just allowed to burn down monasteries. It had no consequences. No wonder Jerome, even during the last years of his life, in several epistles, indulges in occasional sallies of anger against Pelagius, whom he calls a second Catiline. Not sure what that's a reference to. So wow, see this history? Isn't it interesting? Like, this guy got his monastery burned down for coming against the Pelagians. Okay. Position of the Roman Church, condemnation of Pelagius. That's the next section. The question took another turn when it was brought before the Roman See. 2 North African synods in 416, one at Carthage and one at Mileve, now Mela, again condemned the Pelagian error and communicated their sentence to Pope Innocent. A third and more confidential letter was addressed to him by 5 North African bishops, of whom Augustine was one. Pelagius also sent him a letter and a confession of faith, which, however, were not received in due time. So interesting. So notice, it's 5 bishops. It's not just Augustine alone that is writing to Pope Innocent. Or I don't know if he was even called Pope then, the Bishop of Rome. Innocent understood, but it's interesting. There was a confession of faith that was not received. So you wonder if the Roman bishop Innocent, if he would have received that, it may have changed his view. Innocent understood both the controversy and the interest of the Roman See. He commended the Africans for having addressed themselves to the Church of St. Peter, before which it was seemly that all the affairs of Christendom should be brought. So there's your Bishop of Rome asserting his authority as the Church of St. Peter, of whom had the keys. He expresses full agreement with the condemnation of Pelagius, Celestius, and their adherents, but he refrained from giving judgment respecting the synod of Diospolis, or Diospolis. But soon afterwards, in 417, Innocent died and was succeeded by Zosimus, who was apparently of Oriental extraction, 417 to 418. At this juncture, a letter from Pelagius to Innocent was received, of which he complained of having suffered wrong and gave assurance of his orthodoxy. Celestius appeared personally in Rome and succeeded by his written and oral explanations in satisfying Zosimus. Sorry, I got this cough. He, like Pelagius, demonstrated with great fullness his orthodoxy on points not at all in question, represented the actually controverted points as unimportant questions of the schools, and professed himself ready, if in error, to be corrected by the judgment of the Roman bishops. That's interesting. So Celestius was successful in getting the new Roman bishop, who apparently was of the persuasion of the more Pelagian, semi-Pelagian position on anthropology at the time. And he kind of diverted, saying, well, I'm Orthodox, probably on matters of Christology and the Trinity and those type of things. And once again, repeated his, these are just matters of the school. These are intricate details. They really don't affect the heart of Christian doctrine. And then he did end up saying, but, I'll be corrected by the judgment of the Roman bishop. So this guy's pretty sharp in his ability to evade these things. Zosimus, this bishop of Rome, this new one, who evidently had no independent theological opinion whatever, now issued in 417 to the North African bishops an encyclical letter accompanied by the documentary evidence, censuring them for not having investigated the matter more thoroughly and for having aspired in foolish, over curious controversies to know more than the Holy Scriptures. Okay. So the new Bishop of Rome writes back to the North African bishops and says, you're wrong. You didn't investigate it enough. And you're also, you're getting into over curious controversies, and you're claiming to know more than the Holy Scriptures. So that's what he sent back to them. At the same time, he bore emphatic testimony to the orthodoxy of Pelagius and Celestius and described their chief opponents, Hieros and Lazarus, as worthless characters whom he had visited with excommunication and deposition. They in Rome, he says, could hardly refrain from tears that such men who so often mention the gratia Dei and the adjuratum divinum should have been condemned as heretics. Finally, he entreated the bishops to submit themselves to the authority of the Roman see. So basically, he writes back and says, I have ruled, I'm the Bishop of Rome. Pelagius and Celestius are Orthodox. You need to accept that. This temporary favor of the Bishop of Rome toward the Pelagian heresy is a significant presage of the indulgence of latter popes for the Pelagianizing tendencies and of the papal condemnation of Jansenism. And if you don't know what Jansenism is, that's an interesting group that was a very hard Augustinian group that came later in the history of the church, and the Roman Catholics condemned them. The Africans were too sure of their case to yield submission to such a weak judgment, which, moreover, was in manifest conflict with that of Innocent. So it's interesting. So Innocent and, I'm sorry, what was his name? Zosimus ruled differently. So much for the, authority of the Bishop of Rome, who is infallible in all matters of faith. You have an instance where they disagree with each other on this issue. But notice back here, are the African bishops saying whatever the chair of St. Peter rules, that is what we believe? No. So you don't have any evidence of this papal supremacy even back in 400. But if you talk to a Roman Catholic apologist, they act like that was the case from day one. In a council at Carthage in 417 or 418, they protested respectfully but decidedly against the decision of Zosimus and gave him to understand that he was allowing himself to be greatly deceived by the indefinite explanations of Celestius. In a general African council held at Carthage in 418, the bishops, over 200 in number, defined their opposition to the Pelagian errors in 8 or 9 canons, which are entirely conformable to the Augustinian view. They are in the following tenor. Okay, so we're going to read these canons. So notice, this is all Augustine. It was all Augustine. He made it up. Pelagius wasn't really Pelagian. We had 200 bishops. 200 bishops. So once again, is the history of the Pelagian Augustinian controversy just one of Pelagius versus Augustine? No, there's 200 bishops at this council at Carthage at 418 that are agreeing with Augustine. Well, Augustine had them all hoodwinked, and he's a great conspiracy theorist. It just doesn't make sense of history. It just doesn't. Okay, let's read these canons that they came out with the Council of Carthage 418. Number 1, whoever says that Adam was created mortal and would, even without sin, have died by natural necessity, let him be anathema. 2, whoever rejects infant baptism or denies original sin in children so that the baptismal formula for the remission of sins would have been taken not in a strict but in a loose sense, let him be anathema. Whoever says that in the kingdom of heaven or elsewhere there is a certain middle place where children dying without baptism live happily, Beate vivant, well, yet without baptism they can enter into the kingdom of heaven, i.e. into eternal life, let him be anathema. The 4th canon condemns the doctrine that the justifying grace of God merely affects the forgiveness of sins already committed, and the remaining canons condemn other superficial views of the grace of God and the sinfulness of man. At the same time, the Africans succeeded in procuring from the Emperor Honorius edicts against the Pelagians. Okay, so now we have the church-state connection, right? So remember, you not only had the church at this time, you had the Roman Empire, which had an emperor who would also rule on religious matters. So the Africans were able to convince Honorius to enact political edicts against the Pelagians. Very interesting, right? Very different world than we live in today, isn't it? Where the political authorities get involved in theological controversy. These things produced a change in the opinions of Zosimus In about the middle of the year 418, he issued an encyclical letter to all the bishops of both East and West, pronouncing the anathema upon Pelagius and Celestius, who had meanwhile left Rome, and declaring his concurrence with the decision of the Council of Carthage and the doctrines of the corruption of human nature, baptism, and of grace. Whoever refused to subscribe to the encyclical would be deposed, banished from his church, and deprived of his property. So notice that. So was this a political decision? Maybe so. Because after Honorius, enacts edicts against the Pelagians, and Schaff is even saying it, these things produce a change. So Zosimus, who wrote that encyclical against the African bishops and said, you were wrong, Pelagius is innocent, now he concurs and pronounces anathemas and excommunication upon those who refuse to subscribe to his encyclical. I wonder if that encyclical is still, you can read that, the encyclical of Zosimus against Pelagians. I think there's a little interesting footnote here. No. Okay. 18 bishops of Italy refused to subscribe. So they refused to subscribe to the encyclical of Zosimus, Bishop of Rome. How many of them were there? 18 bishops. Wow, 18 of them. And they were deposed. Several of these afterwards recanted and were restored. Okay, so that's interesting. So there was a opportunity to recant even if you initially were deposed for speaking against the decisions of the Bishop of Rome. The most distinguished one of them, however, the Bishop Julian of Aclanum, a small place near Capua in Campania, remained steadfast till his death, and in banishment vindicated his principles with great ability and zeal against Augustine, to whom he attributed all the misfortunes of his party, and who elaborately confuted him. Julian was the most learned and most acute and most systematic of the Pelagians, and the most formidable opponent of Augustine, deserving respect for his talents, his uprightness of life, and his immovable fidelity to his convictions, but unquestionably censurable for excessive passion and overbearing pride. So that's an important figure, Julian of Aclanum. And I think Augustine has a whole thing he wrote called Against Julian. So Julian and Augustine go back and forth. So notice we have another character here. It's not just Pelagius, right? So let's continue. Julian, Celestius, and other leaders of the exiled Pelagians were hospitably received in Constantinople in 429 by the Patriarch Nestorius, who sympathized with their doctrine of the moral competency of the will, though not with their denial of original sin, and who interceded for them with the emperor and with Pope Celestine, but in vain. Okay, so they found refuge in Constantinople, and the Patriarch there was sympathetic to some of their views. Notice, although not all of them, he did not agree with their denial of original sin. And he tried to intervene for them to get them restored and not have to be in exile, but it didn't work. And then obviously a new pope has come to power, Celestine. Theodosius, instructed by Marius Mercator in the merits of the case, commanded the heretics to leave the capital. Okay, so then they were even expelled from Constantinople. Nestorius, in a still extant letter to Celestius, accords him the highest titles of honor and comforts him with the examples of John the Baptist and the persecuted apostles. Theodore of Mopsuestia, the author of the Nestorian Christology, wrote in 419 a book against the Augustinian anthropology, of which fragments only are left. Okay, so we have other characters who wrote. So see how, I just want you to see, I hope as we're going through this, you're seeing how complex and intricate and all these different details. You need to know these. If you really want to study theology, historical theology becomes a very important background to have these facts, especially when people want to claim the ground of church history and argue on that basis. Of the subsequent life of Pelagius and Celestius, we have no account. The time and place of their death are entirely unknown. Julian is said to have ended his life a schoolmaster in Sicily, AD 450, after having sacrificed all his property for the poor during a famine. Pelagianism was thus, as early as about the year 430, externally vanquished. It never formed an ecclesiastical sect, but simply a theological school. It continued to have individual adherents in Italy till toward the middle of the 5th century, so the Roman bishop Leo the Great found himself obliged to enjoin the bishops by no means to receive any Pelagian into the communion of the church without an express recantation. Okay, so by that time, Pope Leo, in the 5th century, the Pelagians were basically excluded, and you couldn't hold Pelagian views and be in the communion with the church. At the Third Ecumenical Council in Ephesus, AD 431, the year after Augustine's death, Pelagius, or more properly Celestius, that's important, was put in the same category with Nestorius. And indeed, there's a certain affinity between them. Both favor an abstract separation of the divine and the human, the one in the person of Christ, the other in the work of conversion, forbidding all organic unity of life. That's worth digging into. The connection between the Nestorian heresy, which is a Christological heresy, and the Pelagian heresy, which is an anthropological heresy having to do with the grace of God. That's worth digging into. According to the Epistle of the Council to Pope Celestine, the Western acta against the Pelagians were read at Ephesus and approved, but we do not know in which session. We are also ignorant of the discussion attending this act. In the canon, Celestius, as is true, is twice condemned together with Nestorius, but without statement of his teaching. So we know Ephesus, an ecumenical council, condemned Celestius, but it doesn't really list what teachings of Celestius are condemned, but it's safe to say that that was assumed because it had been such a big issue, and the Bishop of Rome was multiple times involved in it. The position of the Greek church upon this question is only negative. She has in name condemned Pelagianism, but has never received the positive doctrines of Augustine. She continued to teach synergistic or semi-Pelagian views, without, however, entering into a deeper investigation of the relation of human freedom to divine grace. So, and that's true. The Eastern Orthodox kind of are in a separate category from this. They do formally condemn Pelagianism, which is important to note, but they're still very synergistic and semi-Pelagian in their doctrine. And then we're not going to get into this section, but now we have a whole section by Schaff, The Pelagian System, Primitive State and Freedom of Man of the Fall, and it goes on and on and on. There's a lot of pages where he gets deeper into the back and forth of the doctrinal issues of the controversy. So there you go. 47 minutes. That wasn't too long. And I hope this was, first of all, educational for you, and also sparks an interest in you to read church history. There's tons of church history out there. I recommend Schaff. I recommend Pelikan, Pelikan, one of the great church historians of recent times. Schaff was before him, I believe. And then there's also single volume church history out there. There's a lot of church history books out there. But if you're going to be an apologist, if you're an aspiring theologian, I believe church history is a subject you must seek to master, you must seek to know, you must read, you must become a lifelong student of church history. It will really benefit you, especially because when you get into debates online, maybe you do formal debates, going back and forth with people in the church, maybe people that you interact with, that you're trying to convince of that you understand the truth of Scripture and you're trying to set it forth, many claims about church history will be made, and many times the problem with the claim is it's too simplistic, it's too broad, it misunderstands the issues. So what we just read here, at the very least, should be used to question those who would simply say, well, Pelagius really wasn't a Pelagian, he was acquitted. It's way more complicated than that. And Augustine was just a Manichaean Gnostic, and his teachings were just from Manichaeanism that he didn't shed. No. There was 200 bishops in Carthage who wrote to the Bishop of Rome stating their disagreement with Pelagianism. Were all 200 bishops Manichaean? Were they all misled by Augustine? I don't think so. So I hope that this, and there's so many other things about claims that are made by the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and many others that can be dealt with by a simple dive into church history and carefully getting the facts and knowing them and putting them together. So I hope that's what you got out of this video. I appreciate everyone tuning in. Future episodes, we had 2 debates that happened with Dr. James White, Jeremiah Nortier on limited atonement was the first one. I definitely want to review parts of that debate. It was interesting. And then Dr. White debated Roman Catholic on the issue of the Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice. I definitely want to dig into some of the things that happened at that debate and discuss those as well. So I'm preparing some episodes for that. And I haven't forgot about my penal substitutionary atonement series. I also want to pick back up in my verse by verse from Romans, which I got to chapter 8 and then I just kind of put it down, but I want to pick that back up and start working verse by verse through Romans again. So thank you if you're a faithful listener. Appreciate your subscribing and sharing. Anyone who found me for the first time, if you would like to follow me, of course, you can subscribe on YouTube if you found me on YouTube. And I also put audio of all these on iTunes, Spotify. I'm basically on through Spreaker, it's called, if you're curious. That's pay $20 a month for it, and it'll blast your podcast audio onto like 25 different podcast platforms. It's really worth the money, and it's a very intuitive system. You can get right on there. I keep forgetting to bring my Bibles in that I have for sale, but newkenbiblerebinding.com. I can rebind your old Bible. Just go to newkenbiblerebinding.com, NEWKEN, newkenbiblerebinding.com. I should get a little slide for that too. And I have two really nice Bibles, two King James Version wide margin sovereign editions. They're beautiful. One is Badalassi Carlo, and the other is this beautiful brown called Mustang Distressed. It's great. I love that leather. But anyway, I should have brought them, but next time I'll show them off to you. But anyway, thank you for joining me today, and see you next time. Thanks, and God bless.